This is an excerpt from Half-Broke Horses by Jeanette Walls. The following summer, I received a letter from Clarice Pearl, a senior muckety-muck with the Arizona Department of Education. She wanted to investigate the living conditions of the children of the Havasupai who lived in a remote stretch of the Grand Canyon. She was bringing a nurse from Indian Affairs to determine if the children met hygiene standards. She asked me to drive the two of them to the canyon and arrange horses and a guide to get us down the long trail to the Havasupai village. Fidel Hanna, the young Havasupai ranch hand from whom Rosemary had a crush on, lived in the reservation when he wasn't staying at the bunkhouse, and I asked him to set things up. He laughed and shook his head when I told him why the superintendent and nurse were making the trip. So just to give you some background, the person who is speaking, the narrator, Rosemary, is her daughter, and she owns a ranch, and Fidel Hanna is a ranch hand who works on the ranch. He is part of the Havasupai Indian tribe, just to give you some background. So he laughed when he was told why they were making the trip. Coming to inspect the savages, he said. My father used to tell the story about how for centuries the Havasu men got up in the morning, spent the day hunting and fishing, came home, played with their children, and lay down with the women at night. They thought life was pretty good, but when the white man came along and said, I have a better idea. I get his point, I said, but my father used to sit around pining for the past too, and I've seen how that kind of thing just eats away at you. I drove the hearse into Williams, bringing Rosemary with me to pick up Miss Pearl and the nurse, Marion Finch, at the depot. So just to let you know why she's driving a hearse is because she got this hearse and she uses it as a taxi around the town where she lives. So she went to pick these two people up. Both of them were stout and pucker-mouthed with short, bobby-pinned hair. I recognized the type, disapproving do-gooders. They always had very high standards, and they always let you know when you didn't quite measure up to them. As we headed north, I tried to entertain my customers with a little Indian lore. Pai meant people, I explained, so Havasupai meant people of the blue-green water. There were also the Yavapai, the sun people, and the Wallapai, the tall pine people. Havasupai, who lived in a narrow valley on the banks of the Colorado River, regarded the water as sacred and threw their babies into it when they were a year and a half old. Before they've learned fear, I said. That's just the kind of practice we're concerned about, Miss Fitch said. I glanced over at Rosemary and rolled my eyes. She stifled a smile. After about 2 hours, we reached the hilltop, a desolate spot out in the sagebrush at the canyon's rim, where the horse trail led down to the village. There was no sign of Fidel Hanna. We all got out of the hearse and stood there listening to the wind, my two customers clearly disgusted with the unreliability of the heathens they'd come to help. All of a sudden, a band of young Indians on horseback, half naked and with painted faces, galloped up the trail and circled us, whooping and brandishing spears. Miss Pearl turned white, and Miss Finch gave a shriek and covered her head with her arms. But by then I'd recognized that the ringleader, under his war paint, was Fidel Hanna. Fidel Hanna, what the blazes do you think you're doing? I hollered. Fidel pulled up in front of us. Don't worry, he grinned. We no scalp 'em white ladies. Hair too short. Then he and the other Havasu boys all started laughing, so beside themselves with glee at their success at terrorizing the do-gooders that they almost fell off their horses. Rosemary and I couldn't help chuckling too, but my customers were outraged. You all belong in the reformatory, said Miss Pearl. Miss Pearl declared. No harm done, I said. They're just kids playing cowboys and Indians. Fidel pointed at 3 of his friends who jumped off their horses and doubled up with the others. Those are your mounts, he said to us. Then he held out his hand to Rosemary. You can ride with me, he said. He pulled her up behind him, and before I could say anything, they were off galloping down the trail. Miss Pearl, Miss Finch, and I followed at a walk on our horses. The trail to the village was 8 miles long, and it took most of the day to travel it. The path wound down the side of the canyon through a series of steep switchbacks, passing walls of limestone and sandstone, layered like giant stacks of old papers. Several years later, some missionaries had tried to haul an upright piano down to the village so the Havasupai could sing hymns, but it had fallen off the cliff. We passed its smashed remains, black and white keys, twisted, rusting wire, splintered wood, lying among the rocks. After a few hours, we came to a spot where clear, cold water gushed from an artesian spring, and that was where the stony landscape of the upper canyon gave way to lush greenery. Cottonwood, watercress, and willows lined the trail. The air was cool and moist and still. Rosemary, Fidel, and his friends were waiting for us by the stream, letting their horses graze, and we all continued together. The stream, fed by additional springs, gathered in strength and size the further we went. Eventually, we reached a spot where the stream descended in a series of short falls, and we rode on for a ways before reaching the most breathtaking place I'd seen in my entire life. The creek poured through a gap in the cliff wall and cascaded 100 feet down to a turquoise pool. The air was filled with mist from the thundering fall. The water's vivid blue-green came from the lime that leached out from the underground springs. The mist in the air had the same lime in it, had covered everything near the fall, trees, bushes, rocks, with a white crystallized crust, creating one big natural sculpture garden. It was mid-afternoon by the time we reached the Havasupai village, a collection of wattle huts where the stream flowed into the Colorado River. Around the huts, the stream fed into several pools of the same turquoise water. Naked Havasupai children were splashing in the water. We all dismounted, and Fidel and his friends dove into the biggest pond. "Mom, can I go swimming too?" Rosemary asked, so desperate to get in the water that she was hopping from foot to foot. "You don't have a swimsuit," I said. "I could swim in my underwear." "Certainly not," Miss Pearl piped up. "It was improper enough for you to be riding behind that Indian boy. And it would be unhygienic," added Mrs. Finch. "There's no telling what you'd find in that water." Fidel showed us to the guest hut. It was tight. There was enough room for the four of us to stretch out on the mat on the dirt floor. Miss Pearl and Miss Finch were tired and wanted to rest, but Rosemary and I still had some gas left, and when Fidel offered to show us the valley, we took him up on it. He found us all fresh horses, and we set out on a tour. Walls of red Coconino sandstone and pink Talibab limestone rose steeply on both sides of the river. The narrow strip of bottomland was green and fertile, and we rode past 2 rows of widely planted maize. Once upon a time, Fidel said, the Havasupai had spent the winter hunting game up on the plateau and come down to the valley to farm in the summer. But ever since they lost their traditional hunting grounds to the Anglo settlers, they remained holed up down here year-round in the most remote spot in the entire West, a secret, hidden tribe living life the ancient way, while most people in the outside world didn't even know it existed. Fidel pointed out a pair of red rock pillars towering above the cliff wall. Those were the Legwigliva, he told us. They protected the tribe. It was said that any Havasupai who left for good would be turned to stone. "This place is like heaven," Rosemary said. "Even more than the ranch. I could live here forever." "Only Havasupai live here," Fidel said. "I'd become one," she said. "You can't become a Havasupai," I said. "You have to be born one." "Well," Fidel said, "the elders do say Anglos can't marry into the tribe, but as far as I know, no one ever really tried to, so maybe you could be the first." As evening came on, the Havasupai offered us fried cornmeal cakes wrapped in leaves, but Miss Finch and Miss Pearl would have none of them, so we ate the biscuits and jerky that I had packed. Next day, Miss Finch gave medical exams to the Havasupai children, while Miss Pearl discussed their education with their parents, sometimes using Fidel as an interpreter. The village had a one-room school, but from time to time over the years, the state had decided that the Havasupai children weren't getting a proper upbringing and had swooped in to round them up and send them to boarding school, whether their parents wanted it or not. There they learned English and were trained for jobs as porters, janitors, and telephone operators. After a morning of interpreting for Miss Pearl, Fidel sat down next to me and Rosemary. "You people think you're rescuing these children," he said. "They just end up unfit for both the valley and the world outside. Take it from me, I was sent to that school." "Well, at least when you left you didn't turn to stone," Rosemary said. "What turns to stone is inside you."